So today we are going to be talking about biology and then psychology. So we're going to start a little bit with cognitive development, and then we're going to talk about mental disorders and psychopathology in a little bit. There's a lot of material in this lecture, and it's pretty important stuff. So for the sake of time, I did throw a lot of information onto slides, so some of the slides may be very dense. So feel free to pause whenever you want. You can slow down the video if you want, if that's helpful for you. You can print the slides out. I didn't include any review questions this week, just because, like I said, for the sake of time, I just wanted to make sure I got everything out. So let's dive right in. We're going to start with Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So just a quick summary, Jean Piaget was a prominent developmental psychologist from the 20th century, and he developed a theory in which he split the cognitive development of humans into 4 sequential stages. So Piaget believed that human cognition grew from a restructuring of mental processes that resulted from biological maturation and input from the environment. So he didn't necessarily believe that small humans were just they were just little humans that thought the exact same way that adults did with less knowledge. He was really one of the first people to believe that their minds actually work differently, and that they would grow, and throughout their life, they would acquire more. They would acquire like more matured mental processes as they aged. So the 4 stages that he divided child development into is the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. So the sensory motor stage usually lasts from about birth to 2 years. And during this stage, infants are pretty much learning about the world completely through their senses and completely through their motor skills. So the many cognitive abilities do develop during this stage, since they're experiencing such rapid biological growth. And a couple of the important concepts that you should definitely associate with this stage: object permanence is the understanding that objects or people still exist even when you can't see or hear them. So for example, a child that hasn't developed object permanence yet will think that a block disappeared if you hide it behind a wall. That's why they are so amused when you play peekaboo with them, because they don't understand that you're still there even when they can't see your face. So object permanence actually does develop between birth and 2 years, and that's one of the bigger indicators that the child is progressing properly through the sensory motor stage. Self-recognition is also another phenomenon that we see during this stage, and it's the understanding of oneself, one's traits, behaviors, and feelings. So the child will actually become self-aware during the sensory motor stage as well. Deferred imitation is the repetition of an action at any point in time after the original action actually occurred. So it's a lot simpler just to imitate something while you're watching it, but this deferred imitation is also indicative that the child is developing cognitively, because they can delay that imitation. It's a form of learning. And representational play as well. It's pretend play during which a child uses objects symbolically to represent people, actions, and locations. So any sort of pretend play, if they're using blocks to represent people or to represent animals, that also develops during this stage. So during this stage, babies also may experience stranger anxiety, and that's distress when presented with an unfamiliar person. So after they start to accomplish all of these, they enter what we call the pre-operational stage, and that's usually from 2 years of age to 7. So during this stage, children begin to think about the world symbolically rather than relying solely on sensory information and motor functioning. So when we were in that stage right before this, they're pretty much just observing and learning about their world using their senses. They're not really capable of symbolic thought. They're not capable of abstract thought. But during the pre-operational stage, they start to think about the world symbolically. They can understand symbolic concepts rather than just having something in front of them, concrete. So children begin to use language and mental imagery to represent ideas in the world around them. And that is just one of the examples of them starting to understand the world symbolically. So the use of language is a use of symbolic information. Children are not yet able to think logically or critically. The world is only what they see, which means they don't really have higher thought processes yet. So what you see is what you get. That's the world that they understand, and that's the world that they're currently living in until they can develop they can develop biologically and start to understand more abstract concepts. So they demonstrate something called animism. And when we use the word animism in psychology, what we're talking about is the tendency to personify inanimate objects. So you see this all the time with child play. They may think that their doll is alive, or they may think that their stuffed animal of a dog is alive. And it's completely normal behavior. It's just indicative that the child is starting to think symbolically about the world, and that occurs during the preoperational stage. And similarly, they're also going to experience egocentrism, sort of what we were talking about, where they're only able to understand what they see. So kind of similarly to that, they have this inability to recognize that others see the world from a different perspective. So they don't really understand the concept that other people are perceiving the world at the exact same time as them, but they're having a different experience. So if a child that has not been able to break this egocentrism, if they're watching a TV show, for example, and the mother is in another room, and the mother walks in, the child might ask the mother about something that happened on the TV show, because the child does not understand that because the mother is not in the room, that the mother is not seeing the TV. All the child knows is that the child is watching TV, so that's just generalized to everybody else because of this constraint of egocentrism. So the concrete operational stage is the third stage, and that's from about 7 to 11 years of age. So in this stage, children develop the ability to think logically about concrete events as opposed to abstract concepts. So they're not able to think about abstract concepts yet, but they can think logically. They're starting to problem solve about concrete events and concrete things in front of them. So during this stage, the concept of conservation arises. So what that means is children will understand that certain properties remain the same despite a change in appearance. So if you look down at the bottom, this graphic right over here, Piaget's conservation task, what he does is fills up two cylinders, A and B, fills them up with the exact same amount of water, and he'll ask a child, do these cups have the same amount of water? The child will usually say yes. He'll then take either A or B, the fluid, pour it into C, it's a taller, thinner cylinder, hold them next to each other, and then ask the child the same question. Do both of these contain the same amount of liquid? If conservation has developed, if they have reached that point in their development where they are able to understand that, they will answer and say, yes, there's the same amount, because they can understand logically, it tracks that the same amount of liquid in B is going to be the same amount of liquid in C. If they have not developed that, though, the fact that the liquid is so much higher in the container marked C than the container marked A, they might think that there is more liquid in C. So if they respond and say that there is more liquid in C, even though they saw B being poured into C, they have not yet developed conservation. But usually by 11 years, children are able to understand conservation, and it works for them. And children, again, begin to become less egocentric, and they begin to grasp mathematical concepts. And these are basic mathematical concepts, just like the 4 operations, and it's usually something very concrete. So we have to talk in analogies. So if we're talking about 10 minus 5, we'll say something like, I had 10 cookies and I gave 5 away. How many do I have? Because they have to have this concrete understanding of what they're doing. They're not able to really process these sorts of concepts abstractly yet. However, we get to the formal operational stage at about 12 years old. And during this stage, children are learning to reason abstractly now. So these are going to be about concepts and objects that are not actually physically present. So this is the start of true critical thinking, true abstract thinking. So for example, kind of like I just said, they will understand subtraction without having to set up the problem as taking away cookies from a friend. So instead of saying, I have 10 cookies and I take 5 away, how many do I have now? You can go to a 12-year-old and say, what is 10 minus 5? And they will understand, and they will be able to logically follow that in their mind without having to set it up against a concrete problem in the world. So adolescents are now able to think critically. They hypothesize about possible scenarios, and they understand moral reasoning more completely. So they can also construct and follow an argument without having to think in terms of example. So obviously, different arguments and different things that we say will vary in complexity in terms of their idea, in terms of how abstract they are. But up until this point, if you need to explain something to a child and they haven't really developed those abstract thinking skills yet, the best possible way that you can get it across to them is just by giving them example after example after example. Once they reach the formal operational stage and they start to develop that abstract thinking ability, you don't have to give as many examples, if at all. So depending on how complex it actually is, they will be able to construct and follow that argument in their own head.